Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome back to the Climate Pioneers Show as we kick off Series 7. As you'll know by now, each series we have a specific focus. And for this series, we are going to be talking about a topic that is very close to my heart: hiring and building teams. Hiring the right people is arguably the most important thing you need to do as a founder. And how you build out your early stage team is crucial, as it will set the foundation upon which the future of your business will grow. So throughout the course of this series, I'll be speaking to founders, investors, coaches, and specialists across the full spectrum of HR, talent, and employer brand, giving you access to valuable insights and advice as you build your team. And today I am joined for episode 1 by Heidi Lindvall, a general partner and investor at Pale Blue Dot, an early stage VC backing visionary founders building future shaping businesses across Europe and the US. Heidi herself is a recovering startup founder, having founded and built 3 B2B businesses and led 2 accelerators before moving into the world of investment in 2020. Pale Blue Dot now have 33, I think that's right, portfolio companies. And so Heidi has seen hiring and team building, both from the perspective of a founder, an accelerator, and an investor, giving her a broad and unique insight that I'm really looking forward to digging into today. So Heidi, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me. It's really good to be here. And I can say that we're now at 40 plus, I think, in terms of investments. But yeah,
I've totally undersold you.
All good, all good.
It's been a busy 4 years.
It's been a busy 4 years for sure.
So I thought it would be really interesting to start back at the beginning, right? And talk about your foundational experiences of hiring and building teams as a founder, because you spent nearly 10 years, that sort of first decade of your career, really founding 3 companies and building teams. So when you first started out, what did you know about team building and hiring, and how did you build that? Was it sort of learning as you went? Were you sort of straight in at the deep end? Talk me through those early years of growing businesses and building teams.
Yeah, no, so it was definitely not something that I, had good experience to do. I kind of just started and went in head first. First of all, I would clarify that not all of those were kind of startups and tech startups. Right. So, my first one was more of a kind of media business, and then I built a few different startups, a B2B SaaS and more of a marketplace afterwards. But in terms of how I went about it, I really, I'd never been at like a real job before, to be honest. So I'd never been on a kind of corporate ladder and honestly only knew things about leadership from reading things and watching things. So it was very, very new to me. And I definitely am a person who learns by doing, even when I have to make my own mistakes. So I made a lot of mistakes. I think the biggest kind of foundational mistake that I kept doing at the start was just hiring people who I wasn't long-term aligned with. And this was both in terms of, finding co-founders or kind of finding an early kind of tech engineer co-founder that you really weren't completely aligned with the vision, but you really enjoyed working with that person and the day-to-day worked well and we had really complementing skills. But in terms of where you wanted to take the company, it just wasn't aligned. And it's such a silly fundamental mistake. But I do think people still do that when they feel like, oh, but I like this person, I like working together, I think everything's great, but you actually don't think far enough to say, but why are we doing this? And is that going to be something that we're aligning over the next 5 or 10 or 15, 20 years? Is it actual line with where they want to go in their career? And yeah, that was one of the main mistakes I made, but I made a lot of mistakes. I don't even know where to start.
And did you have anyone advising you? Because like you said, you sort of learn by doing, right? And that is so often the case, right? So many startup founders that I speak to, especially first-time founders, this is, as I said in the intro, arguably one of the most important things you do in your business. And yet none of us really have any training in it or any experience in it or any help in it. So yeah, what were some of the resources that you perhaps used over time? Were there any to help upskill you?
I asked for a lot of help in terms of who should be in the team, but it honestly was more from a skills perspective. Again, I think it's a huge mistake to think more about what are the skills we need. So I feel like a lot of times you're a startup, you work on this kind of financial forecast, you try to figure out more from a perspective of what do we need in terms of skills to get us to the next round, and you're really thought to kind of create that material, but you think less about the person and what type of personality you want to have involved, and how, the dynamic with you, and again, long-term goals, and whether you work long hours or whatever it is that is kind of important to you. So I really ask for a lot of help in terms of like, what does the perfect B2B SaaS business team look like at pre-seed or at seed, etc. And then I kind of modeled from there, and then I just try to find people who kind of were really passionate about what we were doing, who within that role. And I think, again, I think it's the wrong way to approach it. I mean, I think you need to do that, and of course you need to have an idea, but at an early stage, it's so much more about being able to do a bit of everything, and it's really so much more about finding these kind of core team members who really can kind of jump in. And I think, I feel like having kind of ops people in that sense is really, really useful at an early stage, because they can kind of just take anything that you need help with, and they can help with the fundraising and with your deck, and they can help with commercials, and they can help with a team, and they can help with recruitment. Like, they can help with a bit with everything. But I feel like it's never something that you would kind of write down that I'm going to hire someone to do ops, but it's actually what you need a lot of at the beginning. So yeah, those are kind of some of the things that I struggle with. And then of course there are the more kind of typical, that you need someone who can build a product. Especially I was a non-technical founder, and really needed to hire product people, and I found that extremely hard. What I did was I did ask for help on this one, and I did ask people who I knew who could actually help kind of advise and be part of the interviews, etc., to try to find the right type of people. But even then, again, this is like 15 years back, but I kind of very much learned by making some mistakes and realizing, okay, this person is really good at this, and maybe this person was a great first hire because they could really quickly get an MVP out and really build exactly what you needed them to build. And then I remember when I hired the second person, this person was like, oh, this code is just not even like readable. Like, it's just not possible to build on top of it. And everything is kind of hard coded. And I'm just like, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Like, again, where it's all from the outside, it looked beautiful. And then you had to like restart the building at some point. So again, just not having enough help. And I really was bad at asking for help, because I didn't understand how hard it is to get the team right. I really didn't understand at the beginning, and I really had to make a lot of mistakes before I could get there. And even then, I mean, to get there, I think it's still hard.
I think that tech is one of those roles where if you get it wrong, and the foundations that they build into your product from the outset are not right, that is almost one of the most damaging wrong hires you can make. Because if somebody in an generalist ops role comes in and puts some inefficient operational processes in place, they're fairly easy to unpick generally. But it's those kind of, like you said, hard-coded tech mistakes, right? Where you're building legacy, bad tech legacy debt in right from the beginning, that's tough to undo.
Yeah, but it definitely is. But I also think, like, to some extent now, I feel like in hindsight, I think that some of the things that I probably would have done the same, even if I knew, but I wish I knew. As in, I would have probably said, you know what, let's do a hard-coded MVP so that we can get something out, so that I can show this demo, so that I can use it for customer discovery and actually have an idea of what is needed. But I wish I knew at the time that you couldn't build on top of it, that it was just an MVP. Like, it was really not even the first version of a product. And I think the difference is, and sometimes I think that's extremely helpful. Like, you really want something just super quick that you can take out, so that you can give people an idea of what you're actually envisioning and what the kind of final product will be. And I think for investors as well, that works really well as an MVP. But again, I don't think I understood it, or I didn't understand it was an MVP. I didn't understand that, because then I kind of sold that product. And then when I got it sold, we had to like start rebuilding and actually build a product that was, more scalable, that you can build on top of, that was built in a much more modularized way, etc. So so yeah, that can be extremely helpful. But yes, I think if you don't know that and you think you're building your full product and then that product can't be scaled and you can build on top of it, then you're really in a bad place and you'll have to start again. So I agree, that is so fundamental. And I think a lot of people, I mean, I'm very much of a fan of people building or part of tech startups and CEOs who aren't technical. And I think we definitely need people from different walks of life and different backgrounds. And I think that, tech as a sector only being reserved for the people who can develop software, for example, is obviously not good enough, and then we're never going to get to solving our biggest problems with just those. However, I think we do need a lot more help and a lot more advice on how do you use tech as a tool, like how do you actually have enough just technical knowledge yourself that you can actually be part of building that type of team without running that department yourself.
And when the mistakes come, because inevitably, founders are going to make mistakes along the way. Not every hire is going to be the perfect hire. Even if you think you're brilliant at hiring and building teams, things are always going to go wrong because people are people. When things do go wrong, or when you make a hire that you've realized is not the right hire, talk me through your experiences there in those early years of how you learned to deal with those situations and how you perhaps make a hire, realize it's the wrong person and have to unpick that situation.
Yeah, I think that's something that I've always been relatively good at, is firing relatively fast. I think I could have done it faster, but now I think a lot of people are still struggling with that. And the idea of hiring fast and firing fast if it doesn't actually work out. And I think I think I was maybe slow at reading the signs, again because I didn't know how the tech was built, etc. But once I did get there, I kind of realized that this is not compatible and we can't continue. And I do think that is something that I still tell people, that as soon as they start bringing it up to me now and start saying, oh, I'm a bit worried about this person, I really try to get them to open up and really try to understand that, fully unpack what's happening. Because I also know that by the time it comes to me, they've thought about it for a long time. It's a thoughtful thing. You don't just mention this to an investor like, oh, by the way, like you mention it to like your best friend. Like if you mention it to your investor, it's an actual concern. You probably have some sleepless nights over it. So at that point, I really try to go deep into like what's actually happened and why do you feel that way, and can it actually be fixed? And in some instances, people really like that other person, that they're just putting it off because, I don't know, they've given them a chance for like the past 9 months. and in other cases, it's maybe more of a kind of dynamic issue, and it's more like you might feel threatened by them, and maybe it's you need to work on yourself, and versus is it an actual issue that's always going to be there, etc. So you try to kind of try to understand and unpack what type of problem it is. And I think but if I go back to the early days, I don't think I had enough knowledge to be able to do that. I kind of felt like, okay, this is off. Like I couldn't really figure out why it's off, but I was a bit like, it's off, I'm going to fire. And I still feel fire fast, but I also think that you need to unpack why you're letting that person go if it's not the right fit. As I mentioned before, I have definitely had people who, have felt threatened because someone else maybe takes up too much space in a sales call, or they're doing, they're stepping on your toes, or they have too much kind of strategy themselves. And then sometimes you have to question, is that actually helpful? Like, why do you feel threatened by that behavior? Or is it actually threatening to you in some way? Or is it actually damaging to the company? And, sometimes it might just be that it's just a personal thing, that it's actually that person is great for the company, but we don't get along, or you're never going to get along, and that's fine too. But at least unpack it before you let that person go.
Yeah. And I think there's also so much on a personal level from the founder wrapped up in it around, I think often, especially again, sort of first time founders, there can sometimes be an aspect of imposter syndrome, right? So then there's this element, well, if it's someone in the team isn't performing or isn't working out, well, maybe it's my fault. Maybe it's because I've not done enough. I've not taught them enough. Sure. And then there's the whole ego piece wrapped into it as well, to lose somebody from the team. Well, how does that look? What's the perception of that? There are so many, problems in the founder's own head, I suppose, that need to be thought through before they can get to a point to address it. But I think that's where it's so hard to do that on your own. And that's where, like you said, talking to an investor or talking to an advisor is So
100%.
did you have business coaches and advisors early on? And is that something you would always advise other people to have?
I did not have enough. I like very, very early on, I didn't. But the further I went, I got much more help. And I went through 500 startups with one of my companies. This is like 2015, so it's a long time ago. But I remember back then, going to Silicon Valley, just meeting a lot of people, suddenly had a lot of advisors around, how extremely helpful it was. Just having people around who actually had built things themselves, who actually have gone through, the ups and downs of running businesses, but also just having so many other founders who were at a similar stage to yourself, and just asking them, like, how are you hiring? Like, how are you fixing these problems? Like, how are you growing as a leader? Like, that was, for me, was extremely helpful. And I think actually it's probably one of the best things I kind of learned through going through an accelerator, was just leadership, and really trying to figure out who I want to be as a leader, but also trying to figure out what advice to trust. Because I do think it's extremely important to have advisors around you. But when I look back, before I had gone through that journey, I would take advice from anyone. Like, I thought anyone who would come to me and kind of, say that, oh, I think you should build a team like this, I'd be like, oh, okay, maybe that's how you should build a team, because I didn't know. And I think it took a while to get to a place where I started trusting myself to really know that this is actually pretty bad advice. And I actually think it's one of the key things that early stage startups need to master, is to figure out, who do you take advice from? Because I think you should listen to all advice, but then you have to filter it very quickly, and you have to very quickly be able to figure out what is relevant and what is worth keeping, and what should you just like let go. And I often, when I talk to my own startups, they ask me a question, I'll tell them, this is what I think, but take what's relevant to you, and like, forget the rest. Like, obviously my experience is never going to be the same as yours. And I will, VCs are very opinionated, right? Like, you'll ask us a question and we'll tell you what we think. And it's no idea if it's right or wrong, but we'll tell you what we think. It's kind of part of our job is to help kind of coach and share our opinion to some extent. So yeah, that is, so I would say that yes, I had some people around me. Not all were great, and the further I went, the more I kind of got to understand who were giving really good advice, and who were really kind of good mentors or coaches I had, and who wasn't given the best advice, or at least not the most relevant for me. And now I actually think it's even more of a problem, because I see so many people out there who are just readily given out advice without any experience whatsoever. And it's really, really hard for people to be able to know what's good or bad. It's almost like it takes a while. Like, you really just have to hear so much of it before you can start understanding what's good or bad. And I always try to make sure that I tell entrepreneurs, like, surround themselves with other entrepreneurs who are in the same stage. And when I sometimes give some advice, I'm like, oh, let me also refer you to this founder whose advice I would trust, or this founder, because sometimes I think it's also helpful to hear it from another founder who's gone through themselves, rather than kind of hearing it from another investor or another mentor or coach, etc. So
and you mentioned there
yes,
that
I think
great way to
getting
do that
advice is important, but
yeah, you said a great place to do that and to immerse yourselves in other founders that are at that same level was through an accelerator, which is obviously something that you did yourself. But in 2018, you moved into the world of startup accelerators, right? Into running an accelerator. So talk me through that. I mean, first of all, why did you make that move out of an operator role into supporting other startups? And then tell me a bit more about, in that role, obviously you had like a really good bird's eye view across all of the people and team related challenges in multiple startups. Were there, like, what were the themes that you were seeing in that world?
Yeah. So there's multiple reasons. I was running my businesses in London. I'd been running a few businesses in London for about 7 years at that time. And none had been very successful. So first of all, like, I kind of had to shut down my last company. I kind of felt like this is it. Like, I don't know what to do. But I also felt that what I had really taken me a long time to learn, including, on hiring and what advice to trust, and, I don't know how to fundraise, how the startup scene works, all of that. What took me almost like 5 years to learn in London, just being in the startup scene and trying to hustle and trying to meet the right people and figure out who are the right people that I should be meeting, etc. then, I kind of caught up and 200x that when I went to Silicon Valley for 4 months, part of 500 startups. And I always say that this was like the best crash course in just startup building that I ever received. And the fact that that was 4 months versus something I feel like had taken me 5 years probably to get to the same stage in London without an accelerator was really crazy. And at that point, I had a few different realizations when I came back, when I shut down my last company, I came back to London. I had a few realizations, and one of them was that I don't think we had the same quality help in Europe as we did as I got in the US. I mean, I was a family of startups. I had a lot of companies who went through YC as well, and I mean, the quality of help and the quality of accelerators was very, very different. And I didn't feel like we had anyone who actually matched that. And I'd seen and been part of multiple kind of mini weeks, etc., in London. So I feel like I had a pretty good idea of what was out there and what the quality was. And then the other thing is I was thinking a lot about, my background. So before starting startups, I was in human rights. My background was in human rights. I used to travel around the world making documentaries on social and global issues. And, one of the reasons I went into tech is because I really felt like we need more people from all walks of life to be part of building tech, and we should use tech as a tool to solve problems. And that's something that I felt really strongly about, that we need more people to be allowed into the tech space so that more people could actually contribute and build solutions, so we can actually start solving some of the biggest problems we have and not just build, more fancier photo sharing apps, etc. So I had those two beliefs, and I really thought about like, where can I actually help on this front? And accelerator was like an obvious thing. Like I got a lot about going to an accelerator, and I felt like I think I could be part of building this type of things in Europe, and I felt like Europe badly needed it. And I also felt like I wanted to be part of helping different type of founders get into the ecosystem. And I felt like there's a lot of things you learn in accelerator, a lot of things you learn in Silicon Valley, these are learned things. Like you can actually just learn how to build, and you can actually learn how to become a pretty good startup entrepreneur. Of course, you have to be entrepreneurial and etc. But there's a lot of things that anyone can actually do. So yeah, I wanted to bring those skills to more people. So that's why I then first was part of setting a program in London, part of Open Data Institute. It was a kind of accelerator called Data Pitch. And then I moved to Sweden to set up Fast Track Malmo over here with Joel, who's my co-founder, now at Pilbledot as well.
And what kind of stage were you taking companies into the accelerator at? How early were they when they were coming into you at Fast Track?
Super early pre-seed stage. So it was often like the first money that they raised. Maybe they had like an angel check, but no one had raised any institutional money. And the idea was very much to help them do that, help them introduce them to the world of kind of institutional investors and fundraising, and really help them understand what that whole journey looks like from a kind of fundraising perspective, and what are your expectations, what is the solution, etc. I really just teach them all of those basic things in terms of like, this is the expectation that you get from here to a billion in terms of valuation, and what does that look like roughly, and what's expected of you. And that goes with everything from what kind of team do you normally have, like what are the key roles, how do you build that team, and how do you spend that money in a wise way, how long does it take. Everything that kind of goes with that is essentially what we try to teach people and help them.
And what were the kind of common themes that you were seeing people were struggling with? Were there a sort of, top 2 or 3 issues that these startups were struggling with from a people and hiring perspective?
Yeah, I think a lot of people did struggle with the similar things that I did early on, which is really trying to understand what kind of personality and what kind of person works really well in an early stage startup. I think, you have to really align expectations. And if you're hiring people who want a 9-to-5 job and, good benefits and very secure, stable environments, then, they shouldn't be joining a startup. And I think it's hard sometimes when you're starting it to really know that what are we looking for, and then it's much more mindset than it is on the kind of skills. It's so easy to look at the CV and say, oh, but they've done this and they've built this, and then you realize right away when you meet them, you're like, yeah, but this is not like a startup type of person. This is not a person who's going to thrive in this environment. And really trying to teach people to essentially teach people what that looks like. I think is something that you spend a lot of time doing. And again, it's more when people, they look at their CVs and they're looking at what skills we need and what looks good on a deck. What looks good on a deck is not necessarily the same person who's going to be that kind of core team member. So yeah, those are some of the kind of key mistakes I've seen people make. And then the other thing I think is this huge separation. Sorry.
That's an amazing point, because I have seen that quite a few times with founders that I work with, where they're thinking about the next fundraise and they're thinking about who needs to be in the team. And if we can say we've got a CTO that's X, insert big name here, it will look amazing. Or they get really wowed by a CV that's got all these kind of big hitter names on it, but actually that person has never worked in a startup. What advice do you give to founders as to how they can assess whether somebody's ready to? Because some people can transition out of bigger tech companies into startup
100%.
and do so really well. Other people can't. So what advice would you give to founders as to how they can assess somebody's readiness to make that leap?
Yeah, I think it really is about having that conversation about what drives a person, trying to figure out where their passion lies. Like, is this a job or is this a passion? Like, is it something they really, do they want to be part of something bigger than themselves, or do they just want to get paid a certain amount, right? Like, I really feel like, is it a job, or is it what I do or what I'm part of? Is such a different thing. And I think the only way you can do that and assess that, it really is just having those more in-depth conversations and really trying to get to know them and try to get to know their work ethic without like asking, like, how many hours do you work, and like what time, how do you feel about this, but really trying to figure out like, how did you solve this problem in the past, and how do you look at this, and what's important to you, what do you want to get out of this, and like, I think just as any co-founder, you do need that person who's kind of hungry, like who really feels like they want to be part of something bigger than themselves. They have something to prove. They care about the problem enough that they're gonna, want to be part of solving it. And you also don't want to keep hiring, right? So you want to find people who really in it for the long term. And I feel like hiring your first 10 employees, like, they're very core to you. They're just like finding a co-founder. Like, some of them might become more important than your co-founder at some stage in the business. So you really, really do need to take that process seriously. And I feel like we talk so much about doing these co-founder surveys and checking alignment with co-founders, but people start acting like, okay, here is the salary, here's the job description, and this is just a job when they put out a job ad. But it's not that. Also keep in mind that these first people, they are the people who are actually building your culture and setting the culture for your company. So that's the other thing to take into consideration. Like, are you aligned with them? Is it the kind of culture that you want to build for your company? Is that something that, or do they add to that? And does it actually become better with them? So yeah, just a lot of really, really fundamental stuff that I feel like people often miss.
Yeah. So not being wowed by the skills, the experience, the companies they've worked for, but focusing more on, do you have good long-term alignment with that person? Is this somebody that's going to be resilient and stick with this through the highs and lows for the long term? Yeah. And a good personality, culture, mission fit is more important than the skills and the previous employers. Yeah.
100%. Yeah. And it's not, it's like I said, it's not a 9-to-5 job, and it's always going to be, there's going to be some evenings and weekends, and it really is just about trying to figure out that, can that person also commit to that at this stage in their lives? Sometimes it might be someone who's completely there, but then they say, but however, right now, my husband lost their job and I need to have a steady income, so I need to do this. And then you're like, well, I can't, like, I have 18 months of runway. That's pretty much the max you're gonna have. And even then, you don't know if this person is the exact person that you actually need. In 4 months, you might find, oh, we can't afford this person right now. Maybe we need them in 2 years. Like, it's really hard to kind of make that commitment. So I feel like people need to know what they're in for, and how unstable it really is, because it really is. And then hopefully you'll get some shares to make up for
it. Some good upside. And sorry, I cut into you there when you were about to come to another challenge that you were seeing these early stage startups face. So one being about, hiring for personality and mission fit above skill. What other kind of common themes and challenges were they facing at this early pre-seed stage?
Well, the other thing I guess a kind of typical one is salary, that it's often very
Mhm.
hard to compete with the
Yes.
type of salaries that people would have who have good experience. And then you have to, you know, you often have to do a bit of a compromise. Obviously, you can offer them more shares and give them a
Mhm.
bit more stock options to kind of make up for it, and then really try to figure out if you can talk them into it. And I think it's really hard to say how much should you actually pay people. Like, I think
Yeah.
when people do hire pre-seed and very early, and then they say, "Oh, but we need to have like the same market salaries," and I just feel like you can't pay what like Google pays or Facebook pays. Like, you just can't. Like, it's just also from an investor's perspective, it feels silly for you to have these crazy high salaries if you're really in a customer discovery phase and you're trying to figure something out. So you do have to find the people who are, willing to kind of compromise on that, but hopefully get the upside of getting some stocks, which hopefully will be worth a lot more than that salary would have been. And then, of course, by in a few rounds in, you will have like a market salary, like that salary will go up. And I think that's something that people struggle with. I've sometimes suggested to startups that you write a contract, and I actually did that with some myself, and I've had some people do that as well, where they've written in the job contract essentially like, once we raise X amount of money, your salary will go up to this. So to really show that they know that there is a pay rise, that they're only taking they're only compromising for maybe, I don't know, maybe a year if it's like a pre-seed,
Yeah.
and really knowing that we can't afford it right now. However, we do want to compensate you, and we do realize that this is a compromise from where you've been before, but try to make up for it. And then, of course, like I said, give more stock options. That's the other one. But I think that's something that people struggle with, to figure out like what is the right rate. And sometimes people go way too low as well. I've seen that where people are like, "Hey, I'm happy to live on like, 2 grand a year, and if I can make it work, then you can make it work." But again, it's hard to then you can get people probably straight out of uni or people with very little experience, but it's hard to get someone who's has a mortgage and say, "Okay, you can only pay half of your mortgage, but like, you'll get upside afterwards." And they're like, "But I actually still have to pay my mortgage." So I
Yeah.
think things like this, then you have to be kind of understandable. Okay, maybe they don't need a buffer, but you can actually you still don't need to match what they had before. So not
Yeah.
start the conversation as in always matching people's salaries, but still being reasonable so that they don't have to, give up their mortgages and fully lose what they kind of built up before either. Like, it's
And
in the end, I mean, as a co-founders, you obviously take a lot more risk than you should expect your employees to do.
to your point about compensation and equity, what would you normally advise is an average or a recommended amount of equity to be giving at that pre-seed stage for those first, let's say for those first 10 hires? What are your thoughts around that?
Yeah, I mean, normally you'd set up like a 10% option pool, maybe 10 to 15%, but normally you'd have like a 10% option pool. And I'd say that you'd see that people have, I don't know, 5 to 8% allocated by the time that they do the next round. So there's maybe a few percent left. And then, so, if that's the 5 to 7, 8, let's say, and then you kind of allocate that between the people. So I would be pretty generous. And of course, again, depending on what compromise that people are making and how junior, senior they are, and how vital they are for what you need to build. Do you specifically need these type of technical skills, or do you need these type of PhDs, etc.? Like, it depends on, of course, like how hard it is to pick. But yeah, generally I would be pretty generous at this stage, and give them that. But yeah, that still is maybe, 0.5% to a percent per person, and for some it's maybe just 0.05, or for some 0.25. So really, it depends
Yeah.
how much that works. And yeah, there are some good resources on this. So when people ask me, I normally say, talk to a few of these founders that I trust on this, and then I'll say that there's some resources, like Index, for example, has some good resources on ESOP and allocation that anyone can check out.
Amazing. Thank you. And in 2020, you launched Pale Blue Dot with your two co-founders. And in that time, you've invested in, I'll
That
get
is
it right
correct.
this time, 40 companies. And you hold board
Yes.
seats. And I think, counting on your LinkedIn, at least 7 of those, at least. There's probably more. So I imagine that you've seen a lot from in that last 4 years when it comes to team building, both positive, both negative? I mean, from an investor, from a VC perspective, how important is the team in your initial investment decision? And how do you judge what a strong team is?
Yeah, I think the team is everything, to be honest. It's literally everything at a pre-seed stage. And I would say that the founders are most of that, though. The founders, so when I say team is everything, it's most of the founders, but sometimes it is the founders and the core team. But that is essentially what we invest in. I normally say that at this stage, it's very much team and the founders and the opportunity, because there's very little built, there's very little proof point. It really is there an opportunity we believe in? And most importantly, is this a team that we want to win? And is it the team that can execute and kind of take this opportunity? And then, of course, you can slice and dice that and try to look at the team in multiple different ways in terms of, whether they are, whether they have the skills needed. But again, the skills you can also hire for. So you have to figure out, like, what do you think are skills that we think is needed? Like, in some instances, you feel like they have to be domain experts themselves, the founders themselves. And in other cases, you feel like you don't have to be a domain expert. You have to be a person who's just really good at executing. But you have to hire XYZ because you need this expertise in-house, etc. So it's hard to say what exactly is needed. And I think it is different for each company. There's nothing that I can say that you always need this role or you always need this type of person. But I would say that you do need to be able to attract a really, really good team, and you need to be able to be good at building that core team. I very often talk to the first kind of hires and the core team members to really get an idea of who this founder is and who this leader is, and again, having an idea of what kind of people they think are good, to try to get an idea of, there's this idea of whether it's kind of good or great. And if you don't see a lot of great team members or employees, then, you might not have a very high bar of like what that is. So sometimes when you interview people, you kind of get an idea of, okay, you've hired this person because you went to school with them and they're the only data analyst versus, and this is an actually really good one. And honestly, that is very, very common. It kind of goes with the idea again, when you start something really early and you just don't know what's good advice. And how are you going to tell if you hire a data analyst? How do you know if it's a good data analyst? The only thing is you're like, oh, but I know them and I trust them and they've been at this company, they must be good. And of course, I'm not saying I know necessarily better either, but you do get an idea of, like, do you think that do you trust them on hiring, and do you actually trust that they can build a core team? And I think that's the core skills that you expect of the founder. I mean, often this founder, so it's often one of the founders who's more on the kind of team building side, right? But being able to know what the team should look like and then attract those people and hire those people, that's really core. That, and like fundraising and sales is kind of the key things that you're going to be spending your time on. So if you can't get that right, and if your core team doesn't look great, then sadly, we're probably not going to move forward with you.
Interesting. And at that really early stage, so at pre-seed stage, like you said, that core, that founding team isn't going to be fully formed yet, right? There are going to be some gaps, and like you said, that's okay.
Yeah.
But where there are the gaps, how important to you is the advisory board when you're making these decisions? And do you think that is good enough to offset where there might be some crucial gaps in the founding team?
Generally, I'm actually very negative on the advisory board. I feel like they are, I feel like this is one thing that when people haven't figured out how to build a good core team, you put the advisory board in your deck and then you say, we have this amazing advisors. And I mean, to be fair, sometimes it gives some credibility. Like sometimes it's needed. Like when you're like doing something, especially when you're not domain experts and you're in a field and you feel like, hey, we want to show that there's some credibility and we know what we're talking about. So we can actually get those advisors who do know what that field, then it can be good. But sometimes I also feel like, I don't know, it's just advisors, they add so little that it's just like this very, it's just this very strange slide. Like in one of my businesses, I built one of my businesses was like a video startup, right? and it was this kind of layered video starter where you could add overlays on top of your videos. And I was in Silicon Valley at the time, and I was trying to figure out like how to get this great advisory board. Now we ended up getting the CTO of YouTube as an advisor, and
Cool.
and the other one, and another person who had sold a very successful video startup. And I mean, these two names were like the best in the kind of video space. And this was great on paper. It was great on paper, but actually they ended up, they advised us very little. Like we got very little help from them compared to all the people around me and all the other people who actually helped us build those businesses. But of course, it was that deck for that pitch deck. It looked amazing, and I look back on it and I kind of cringe a bit, because it's exactly that same mistake that people are doing nowadays when they're like, oh, who would be the best advisor, that it's going to look so good. And I feel like for any investor who looks at like hundreds of decks a week, we see through it. Like we know how you think, and it's just not, and just the fact that you were able to get them to say yes to be on your deck, it doesn't actually mean that they're there building the company with you. And most of them are going to be so busy, they're not going to have time. Maybe they'll get back to your emails, and and in this instance as well, like they were relatively helpful. Like I got a few good questions, but it just, in terms of the work that actually goes into building company, they're not really going to be involved. So yes, I'm sadly a bit kind of negative on this front. And I feel like, again, sometimes it's good to show domain expertise, but most of the time I don't actually put any weight on the advisory board that people have built or that they put on the deck that they have. I really, generally, it's like, and so often it's also just like, these are the kind of the old white men I know in my industry. That's kind of how I read it. And I'm like, great.
That's so funny though, because I've recently started angel investing about a year ago, right? So I'm still quite new to it. This shows my naivety as an angel investor, because I often look at the advisor board slide and I'm like, oh, very impressive. So there you go.
Maybe
I'm
not wrong with that. Just that it doesn't really work on me, but maybe it's because I feel like I tried all the tricks myself and I know how little value they provided, and therefore I'm a bit negative on this front.
No, fair enough. And so with a portfolio of 40 companies, right, I appreciate it's going to be really difficult to choose one, right, that you could give as an example here. So fair, if you have to pick and choose from a few, fine, because I'm sure you've got loads of fantastic teams. But where have you seen in your portfolio this done exceptionally well? So team building and hiring done brilliantly. And why do you think that particular company or that particular team excelled so well at it? What is it they've really nailed in the process, both to attract brilliant people, but then also to really get the best from those people once they're in?
Yeah, I feel like I might not name a company by name, but I actually think that it's only because of what I'm going to say. And I think it's the same companies that have done extremely well and did extremely bad hires as well. The ones I'm thinking about right now, I actually think it's the ones have been like very early, so they've done really fundamental mistakes, just like I did, and just like most people did. But then they've also done some really good, almost accidental hires. And what I mean by that is, I feel like I've seen these really good kind of founder associate type of roles where they really feel like, okay, this is a small role for us. It's like a founder's associate. It's someone who could just help a bit with everything. But those people are so key, because those are the kind of ops people that I kind of mentioned, where I felt like they can just jump in anything and you can just put them in any department. And, they can help a bit on product, they can help a bit on sales, and they can help a bit with recruitment and a bit of everything. And then you realize after a while that they become a very core part of your company. And then if you can then take them from that, pretty junior role and try to figure out whether you put them more towards like a bigger sales role, or whether they actually can head a department themselves as they grow, I think those are the people that could end up being really, really good. And then I've seen this similar companies try to feel like, oh, we don't have any sales experience, for example, and then they try to hire someone really senior salesperson when you're at a team of, I don't know, 10 maybe. And I don't ever think you should hire salespeople that early to give up founder sales. I think you should always do founder-led sales for quite a while, because you're still in customer discovery phase. You're still trying to figure out product market fit, and handing that huge task, which is probably the most important task at that time, to someone else just feels irresponsible. And hiring someone, so I always feel like you should hire a sales team when you have more of a playbook, when you're starting to figure out like, this is what works, this is a kind of, title that we look for, this is kind of budgets they tend to have, these are the kind of questions we ask, this is how we figure out if the product is a fit, and then you follow that. But when you're in this phase of trying to figure out how do we sell to whom, then I think you shouldn't really be hiring them. And yeah, I've had the same people make both of those kind of mistakes. Well, sorry, make those mistakes, those kind of huge mistakes in trying to hire senior people, but also hire really, really good hustlers, really driven, young people that then kind of grow within the company. And I think, and of course, it's not to say that you shouldn't hire senior people, but you should definitely know when to hire senior people, but also hire them if they fit into the culture and they have the same mindset, and they, in every other way, fit into what you're building. Don't hire them because you think it makes you look more mature, for example. Yeah. So yeah, I realize I'm not mentioning any names here, but I do think that it's I think the best companies make a lot of mistakes early on as well.
Yeah, no, it's important.
Kind of part of the learning from it, and then you recover from it.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, quite often, I don't know if this is a trend that you see, but I think especially in those early days, recruitment can often be seen as a means to an end or a finite process. We need to hire for a role, we recruit, rather than it being a constant state of being or a continual building of pipeline, for example. I mean, I remember a great quote from Tessa, who runs Olio, when she was talking about this in terms of fundraising. And she said their motto early days was always be fundraising, right? It's not a means to an end. It's a continual activity. And I definitely feel the same, that founders should be doing the same when it comes to their hiring, constantly talent pipeline building. What are your thoughts around that? And is that a similar mistake you see founders make? What are your thoughts around that?
Yeah, I actually think that's a really tricky one. And I struggle with it myself to figure out, should you always be recruiting? Because yes, I agree that you should always have your eyes open, and you should always be aware of what good looks like or what great looks like in that space, and figure out what talent fits you. But I also feel like people do make the mistake of feeling like this person is just too good to pass on. And then you feel like, yeah, but you don't need a salesperson for a year. Yeah, but they're too good to pass on. Like, I feel like we're not going to get them in a year because they just left this job or whatever. And I'm just like, I don't think you need them right now. And I find that really hard. And sometimes I think that, is it worth having someone around because they can help with some other stuff, or maybe they'll, I don't know, do more of just helping build a pipeline, etc., until they can actually be in a sales role? Or should you just say, actually, we really don't need this right now? Like, you should always be aware, but you should never hire. And I don't know, I've definitely been more on the side of just hire what you actually need at the time, because you have to be very smart about your resources and how you use them. But sometimes when I've seen some people who kind of been around and then end up in a year or two stepping into a really important role, but they've kind of, been helping out and had more of a generalist role before, that I thought maybe it was worth it. So I don't know, but I agree with that. You should always be on the lookout for good talent, and you should always be aware of what's needed, and you should always be kind of critical of where is the team lacking, and where do we need more support, or where do we need to grow our internal skills, or where do we actually need to hire.
Yeah. And how involved do you get as a fund with talent and hiring, and what support around that do you offer to your portfolio companies?
It really depends. Sometimes when it's an early stage company, especially the kind of pre-seed stage, then I do sometimes kind of help them interview as well. And I'm involved at least with the last candidates, but not always at all. It really depends on what they're hiring for and if it's needed, and depending on who else they kind of have around them. And then sometimes I don't have any involvement. Sometimes it's more like, well, we've normally set the kind of financial forecast, so I have an idea that I always have an idea of who they're going to hire. And I mean, if we've said, okay, we've set the financial forecast together, and we think you need 3 full stack developers, and I don't know, you need you need a marketing person this, and then they ended up saying that, oh, we hired a CFO, which was like double the budget. Then I would be like, wait, what just happened? Like that can't happen. Like then I would obviously like react to say that, how did you think that that was reasonable? But if it is more like, these are the roles we have, we've agreed on the roles, and then they just said, oh, we filled this, like we found the customers this, or we found the a customer success person, etc., then I think I'm normally like, amazing, great, who is it, and how is it going, and less involved, and taking less interviews. So I haven't met all the team members, all of my even pre-seed companies, so I'm not always super involved, but some of the teams I know relatively well.
Yeah. And do you see the challenges vary across different geographies? Because your portfolio is across Europe, across the US. Are the challenges around hiring fairly universal, or are there definitely trends across different geographies?
Now I have like 11 companies myself that I'm kind of heading on, that I'm closer with, and I can say that they definitely vary a lot. But I don't have enough data to say that how it's across geographies. But just as an example, I can say that I have some of my German teams have really struggled with getting people to compromise on pay, because a lot of the people haven't been so excited about ESOPs. While, for example, in the US, a lot of people are like, yes, I'll give up like half of my salary if I can get this much more in ESOP instead. Like it's more of a kind of common concept, and people know what it's like to kind of be at a startup, and you and you know that you'll get another upside instead. Well, I think in certain places you're just expected to get kind of market salaries either way. So things like this definitely differ, and a big country to country. But yeah, I don't have enough data to kind of give a lot of those examples.
No, fair enough. Well, Heidi, thank you so much for your time. There's so much value, so much insight in there, that I'm sure the founders listening will take a lot from. So thank you so much. If there was one piece of advice you could leave our founders with, when it comes to hiring and building teams, what would you say?
I would say that this hiring the right people and finding the right core people to your early stage startup is probably, the biggest uh, kind of success determining factor, to me. If you can actually do a really, really good job, that has the biggest impact on whether you're going to be successful versus someone who does a really bad job at that. So I do think that I would really take it very seriously and try to figure out like who do you want on your team and why, and be very, very thoughtful on that process.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you so much.